Hello, Bible readers. We are continuing our way through Genesis by going into chapter 27, verse 46, and getting into chapter 28 through verse 9. And I've been writing out these very careful manuscripts so that I say what I want to say and how I want to say it. And then I come to this, and I feel like the best way to talk about this is way more off the cuff, because this text for today, this piece of Genesis, is so off the cuff. Brueggemann says these verses, 27:46 to 28:9, are an intrusion in the primary narrative. They are unrelated to what precedes and to what follows. And I thought, well, that makes sense, because as you read it, it's like, how do we go from the story I just recounted in the last post to all of a sudden, Jacob has through trickery taken this blessing, and Isaac and Esau have this heartbreaking moment of realizing that Esau's path is going to end in barrenness someday, and it all feels kind of icky. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, and then Rebekah says to Isaac, I'm weary of my life because of the Hittite women. If Jacob marries one of them, what good will my life be to me? Like, what? And then Isaac calls Jacob and blesses him, like everything's okay. Well, where is this coming from? It feels very different, very disjointed. And so this confirms. This is why reading a commentary on a Bible story like Genesis helps so much, because how could we know, since we're not all biblical scholars, how could we know that, yeah, scholars have looked at this and said, not only does it feel disjointed, it's got a lot in common with some other texts here, and here in the Bible that all have the same agenda. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this just by reading from Brueggemann quite a bit. It's usual to assign these verses to the priestly tradition. We'd call it the P tradition. They are dated then to the exile. So the exile is like 597 to 587 BC. And it's during that exile when the traditionists faced a particular theological crisis. Believing people were set in a cultural context where they were tempted by various religious alternatives. So in exile, those who had been pulled out of Israel are now living in a new place, and they are tempted to stop worshiping God and maybe start worshiping Babylonian gods. So the theological agenda of these verses we're looking at from Genesis today, the agenda of the traditionists in exile, is the identity of Israel, of the Israelite community, in the face of possible assimilation. The acute threat of assimilation came to be symbolized by the problem of mixed marriage. So that's why this whole story about, I hope Jacob doesn't marry anybody like that, and I hope Esau doesn't marry anybody like that, it's really a metaphor for the problem of assimilation. By placing this text at this point in Genesis, the traditionists accomplished two things. First, they included a mild criticism of Esau. And why would they do that? Well, Esau and people who aren't Israelites descended straight from Isaac and Jacob, they'd be threats. And so Esau needs to be put in his place, because, in the last story we got sympathetic to Esau. And so the traditionists get to follow that story up right away with, yeah, but he, married the wrong people to begin with. And then the second thing this unit gives is an alternative reason for Jacob's flight from his family to his uncle Laban in Haran. And I find this to be so interesting. So in the primary narrative, that is the story that came before this text that we read for today, Jacob leaves simply to save his own life from the anger of Esau. But this priestly narrative, this capital P author, minimizes that family conflict and gives a positive theological reason for the journey, so that Jacob can find a suitable wife within the family circle. Thus, the priestly tradition would prefer to transform the narrative into parallel with Genesis 24, basically smoothing out Jacob's story a bit. And then Brueggemann says, that attempt is without success, because the claim of the main narrative is more compelling. That narrative asserts that Jacob went in fear for his life, not for the sake of family purity. At best, this later narrative offers a minority report, which would make things more positive and more intentionally theological. I love that even within the scripture that we're reading, there are different traditions vying for our sympathies and attention. Now, we could look at this part, so we're just supposed to disregard this? Brueggemann doesn't go there either. He's saying that this is a minority report, but we're not just supposed to disregard the minority report. Even this minority report has something to say to us. And what that is that there are times when the community of faith faces assimilation, faces temptation to not be themselves anymore, and to instead become what the world is around them. And so the terms Canaanite and Hittite, when they're used in this text, they refer to any people not under the discipline of covenant, the demands of Torah, or ritual obedience. And you could say that the faithful community needs to recognize that Canaanite or Hittite alternatives can be a danger to the community. There are times when concrete steps of discipline must be taken for the purpose of identity and survival. This text invites the listening community, that is us at this point, to ask what time it is and to decide which posture of faith, as we face culture, what is required of us. The text was shaped at a time when cultural embrace and accommodation had gone on long enough to be a threat. And then he goes on to basically ask, do you think your faith community is threatened by the world in any way? At what point do you have to hunker down and remind each other of who you are and what you're really about, and then carry that out with discipline, saying, we will not do this, we will not practice that. So I just find this to be interesting, not only to see how Scripture was made and that we sometimes come across different parts of Scripture that are almost fighting each other, but that we can get past that also and still honor the point that it can still have for our lives today. I am one with my God. My God is with us, all of us, at all times and in all places.